everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dr. Catherine Schuster-Bruce, a medical doctor and journalist working at Insider. Now, I'm delighted that for the next 30 minutes, we have here with us Rick Doblin, who is founder at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, otherwise known as MAPS. MAPS has got closer than any other organization to legally bringing a psychedelic compound to market. MDMA, otherwise known as ecstasy, for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is on track for approval from the regulator in the US as early as next year, according to MAPS. Rick is going to first bring us up to speed with MAPS's trials, and then we're going to have a Q&A. Rick. Hello, Rick. Can you hear me okay?
Hello. Hello, it's a pleasure to be with you all. You know, Amanda just said she flew in overnight from Jamaica. I just flew in home overnight from San Francisco with various meetings, so I'm delighted to be here. Wish I could be in person, but I just couldn't manage it.
Well, thank you for coming. So yeah, if you could start by telling us about the latest MAPS trial results.
Yeah, well, it's very latest results in that we just got the interim analysis for the second phase 3 study of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, and we got the results just a couple days ago. And just to explain briefly what the interim analysis is, the system of drug development is in many ways designed to help pharmaceutical companies succeed. And so when you design the size of your study, you assume a certain effect size, you do your power calculations and your statistics, and then you set the number of subjects that are going to be in the study. And we do this in conjunction with FDA, and we did this with a special protocol assessment process where the FDA and MAPS came to agreement on this was the plan. And so we set the interim analysis was going to be done when 60 of the 100 people, or 60% of the people, had reached their primary outcome measure, and all 100 had been enrolled. And we had set it for 90% or greater chance of statistical significance at a certain specific effect size. So the interim analysis is a process whereby you have an unblinded data monitoring committee that looks at the data and then gives me a number. And the number is either 0 for subjects that we need to add to the study, or a specific number, or tells us stop the study for futility, it's never going to work. And the reason that you can add subjects is that if your effect size isn't as big as you thought in reality compared to what you thought it would be, then the FDA approves on the basis of statistical significance, not effect size. And the more numbers you have in your study, the more subjects, the more likely you are to find smaller and smaller effects. So if I would have been told, for example, that add 10 or 20 people or something like that, that would have meant that our estimate of the effect wasn't quite as good. We would add more subjects, we would still get statistical significance, and we would still get approval. And then the FDA figures out that you're comparing groups between the control group and experimental group, and there's variation within the groups, and then eventually maybe you figure out who it really is likely to help the most, and then those people are the ones that you focus your treatment on. But you can get approvals for smaller and smaller effects, and the SSRIs for PTSD have a very small effect size. So the answer that I got just the other day was that we didn't need to add anybody to the study. And so what that means is that we're on track for statistical significance. The safety is looking good so far as well. The final data point will now be in October. We have completed enrollment of the second phase 3 study. The first phase 3 study was published in Nature Medicine in May of 2021, tremendously successful. And Science, at the end of the year, the journal Science comes up with a list of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of the world. And they said that our first phase 3 study was one of the top 10 scientific breakthroughs of the world for 2021. Yeah, and I think it's really, it's both our study, but it's all of the people in this room and all the people listening. It's really just the fact that we got this designation was because we're the leading edge of psychedelic medicine going through regulatory trials. And so our study was great, but it also is indicative of a whole new era of research. So we're delighted, and we are proceeding to treat the remaining 40 people. And I'll just share that when we think about what could go wrong, I mean, this idea is, how likely are we to succeed? We're 90% or greater likely to get statistical significance. So what that means is that it's really now about safety in the next 40 people, and we have a good safety track record for the first 60. So the thing that could go wrong is that one of the people that gets MDMA could commit suicide. We don't think that's likely to happen. We do enroll people who have previously attempted suicide in our studies. So we're working with the riskiest population. We felt that that was necessary to get over the stigma of psychedelics. And we did have, in the first phase 3 study, one woman tried to kill herself twice during the study, and another woman had such severe suicidal ideation that she checked herself into a hospital in order to not kill herself. And both of those women were in the placebo group. And we didn't have anything like that happen in the MDMA group in the first phase 3 study. So you can see that suicidal ideation, even suicidal attempts, are a background of having severe PTSD. So we're very hopeful that we'll get good results, but we don't know until the final data point is in October. And then it'll take about a year of working with regulatory agencies to get approval in the US and Israel, because our phase 3 data is mostly from the US, but also coming from Israel and Canada. And we are now starting in 7 countries in Europe to train therapists. And what we're hoping, just because you're all in England, is that the MHRA wants to show something that was a benefit from Brexit. And the benefit is that now they're unshackled from European regulation. And so there's a good hope that we can get approval in England before Europe, and potentially even before FDA. So that's what we're working towards.
Got it. So thank you very much for explaining all of that. I was just wondering, is it just MDMA you're going to be focusing on, or are you going to broaden it out into other psychedelic compounds as well?
We're definitely developing a pipeline. I mean, we're 160, well, we're about 180 people now. We're going to be adding about 40 more. Most of those are in the Public Benefit Corp, which is 100% owned by the nonprofit. So maybe only about 35 people are in the nonprofit. The rest are in the pharma development company. And so we do have a pipeline. We did manage to get a $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan from taxes from all the marijuana smokers. And we're doing a study of cannabis for veterans with PTSD. That's palliative rather than curative, the way that MDMA-assisted therapy can be, but there's quite a large number of people that are interested in using marijuana for PTSD. So whether you call that a psychedelic or not, we do. So that's one thing. We're very interested in Ibogaine as well, and I know also that Atai is interested in Ibogaine, and so we're about patients first, and so there may be some ways that we can collaborate with Atai, but I think Ibogaine is a really important substance to bring forth for opiate dependence and other substance abuse, and we've done early long-term observational studies. And I've just double-checked with our team about what the timelines are for Ibogaine. So we hope to have a pre-IND meeting with FDA in early 2023. We're leaving psilocybin, obviously, to all these other groups that are doing work with psilocybin. We did start LSD research for the first time after over 30 years, but we're not moving that yet beyond this initial study that was done in Switzerland with people with life-threatening illnesses with anxiety. I think from a strategic, practical point of view, the most efficient thing for us to do is to look at other indications of MDMA as well, because we'll have all the safety data, we'll have all the therapists trained in MDMA. So we're thinking about eating disorders, postpartum depression, depression without coincident PTSD, and we're also moving into group therapy. And that's something that we've not tried. Everything has been individual therapy, but we now have approved, FDA will approve our group therapy study. We're just in, I would say, arguing is maybe a good word, in that we want to make the overnight stay optional. FDA was interested in requiring an overnight stay, and we've challenged them and said, we like overnight stays. We want to encourage them, but we don't think it should be required. So we think later this year we will start the group therapy study with MDMA.
This is great. You're answering a lot of my questions without me even asking them. So what's the timeline for the MDMA for other uses? So not for PTSD, for other. Do you have a rough time frame for that?
Yeah, we think that in our phase 3 study. So as I said, we're going to have the last data point in October, but that's for all the people that were randomized to MDMA. All the people that are randomized to getting the therapy without MDMA have the option to go through the study again and get MDMA with therapy, and that could add to our safety database, but it's not part of the sort of core drug approval for efficacy projects. So the therapist will be engaged somewhat there, but I think that we will maybe be approved 2024, 2025, I would say, more likely for other indications. One of the big issues will be how many phase 3 studies do we need for these other indications? Can we do it with just one phase 3 study or smaller phase 3 studies, because we don't really need to show safety, but we would very much like to continue to move forward with other indications.
Okay. And you've already mentioned one potential partnership. Do you have any other specific plans, partnerships, for example, to help with drug distribution or therapist training?
We are speaking with Cosmo about collaborating. I guess I'm not sure quite how much I can say because they're more of a publicly traded company, so I don't know quite how, or they will be eventually one day. But we are thinking about partnerships very much so, because we really want to provide access to people all over the world as quickly as we can. I think that the safety data that we are generating and all the data from the manufacturing of MDMA, we have a lot to give to people who want to do other indications of MDMA. We can accelerate their development, so we could partner on some of those instead of doing it ourselves. The other thing from a financial point of view is this idea of data exclusivity. So we don't have patents, we have data exclusivity, and we'll get 10 years in Europe for making MDMA into a medicine. For PTSD, we'll get basically 5 years in the US plus another 6 months for doing pediatric studies, which we will do with adolescents with PTSD. But if you do another indication for MDMA, then you get 3 years more in the US data exclusivity. But what we've understood, or what our current assumption is that once MDMA goes generic from MDMA for PTSD, even if we have data exclusivity extensions for other indications, it's likely that the payers will buy the generic rather than buy from us at a much higher price. And what that means then from our strategic point of view is that we should accelerate the development of other indications as quickly as we can from a financial point of view, so that the approvals are under this initial period of data exclusivity. So that also gets to why we would want partnerships with other groups. We want to really accelerate the development of other indications.
Okay. And I would also love to hear about your plans for the insurance aspect of MAPS's MDMA and other potential psychedelic compounds. How much of these costs do you think insurance companies are going to cover? And will that differ from country to country?
I think it will. I think that we will get a very good chance of getting 100% coverage. I mean, there will be co-pays and things like that in the US. I think that the coverage, I think, in national healthcare will also be likely to be able to be obtained, but chances are it'll be at a lower price with countries that have this national healthcare. But there's another advantage, actually, of working with national healthcare, is that they tend to look more at an overall situation. So not only do they look at the cost of treating the disease, the cost to society, but the cost of disability for people that are unable to work if they're disabled from PTSD or depression. So in the US, insurance companies don't really take much into account about disability payments. And in Europe and in national health care, even though it comes out of different buckets, they're both government buckets. And so I think that we will be able to make a very good cost effectiveness argument for national health care coverage as well as for insurance coverage. The other challenge of this is having to do with patient assistance funds for people that can't afford it. Because when you see, well, in America, you see all these TV ads that are about, if you can't afford the drug from pharma, contact us, we'll have a patient assistance program. And so it's easy relatively because they give the drug, which they can manufacture for very little amount of money usually. And that's the treatment. But if we give people basically free access to MDMA, it doesn't do them any good if they can't also afford the therapy. So that's going to be a challenge for all of the companies in the space. How do we actually provide patient assistance funds for people that don't have insurance coverage so that it's not just going to people that are employed and have coverage? That's not an issue in national health care where everybody's covered. And this gets to one advantage I think I'll talk about Howard's strategy, which is that the dual strategy of drug development and drug policy reform leading to drug legalization. We think that to provide access, which I'd say is sort of the core of your question about insurance coverage, we believe that the access, fundamental human right, people should have access to these drugs, whether it's a licensed legalization system or some other way. And we want to embed in the culture training about peer support, how to approach a psychedelic experience, what are things to watch out for, what are things to emphasize, so that the access that we want to provide to people for this long-term goal of mass mental health involves both drug policy reform and also drug development. And I think for those people that don't have insurance and stuff, this will be one way. And I actually think that it's going to be good for the business model. The legalization will enable destigmatization. More people will sort of understand and tell stories of healing. And I think that there'll be even more people that would want to go to the clinics. It will not be, here's an MDMA clinic, here's a psilocybin clinic, here's a ketamine clinic. It'll be therapists that are cross-trained in all the modalities, and they will decide and customize a personalized treatment approach for each patient. And I'll just sort of, because you just had Amanda and Cosmo, I'll just say a plug, which is one of the things that I really appreciate about their collaboration is that Amanda, through the Beckley Foundation, is committed to drug legalization. And so it's not just trying to medicalize, it's they have a broader perspective, and we do as well.
Okay, thank you. Lots of food for thought there. And I think probably a lot of people in the audience are quite curious and may have read about recent criticisms of MAPS in the media, reports of sexual abuse, reports of worsening of suicidal thoughts. How do you respond to these criticisms?
Well, we have had a terrible situation where one of the therapists, we've had about 360 patients that have been treated, and there's one case that we're aware of in which a therapist initiated a sexual relationship with the patient afterwards. And so that's one too many. And we immediately fired the therapist, notified all of our other therapists, made a public statement. This is back in 2017. And so, as far as we can tell, it hasn't happened before. It hasn't happened since. So, yes, that's really bad. And we believe that we will, try to minimize that so it never happens again as much as we can do that. As far as worsening of suicidal symptoms, we're not saying that what we're doing works for everybody. In our first phase 3 study, we showed that at the 2-month follow-up, 67% of the people who had severe PTSD no longer qualified for a diagnosis of PTSD. 21% still had PTSD but had clinically significant reductions of PTSD symptoms, and 12% did not respond at all. So the importance for this criticism, you could say, about people that said that their suicidal symptoms were made worse, I think first off, we want them to participate in our long-term follow-up. We're trying to gather all that data. But there's a difference between clinical research and future practice. So in clinical research, we're limited to a protocol that's the same for everybody, and it's only 3 MDMA sessions 1 month apart. in practice, people who are still opened up and emotionally still need more work could get a fourth session or a fifth session. So the people that were talking about increased suicidality were basically saying that the therapy ended too soon. They said that the therapy was valuable, but it ended too soon. They were still opened up. They still had a lot of things to work on. And we could not do that with them with MDMA. And so in practice, I think that post-approval, those situations will be minimized. But we want to gather all that data. Where I'm saying that one of the things that could occur is if an MDMA person commits suicide. That would be really bad, but that's also, again, part of the background situation. So we're trying to, do whatever we can. And we also do permit our therapists to have some extra sessions if the people need them, other than what's in the extra non-drug integrative sessions. So that's possible as well.
Okay. And how do you think the industry should safeguard against sexual abuse and worsening of suicidal thoughts happening if and when it gets rolled out wider?
Well, I think there's a really interesting question that gets related to this question about insurance and about the credentials of the therapist. So I personally think that the two-therapy team helps to reduce sexual abuse. It did not work in this case. It was, again, a husband-wife team. It was a two-person team, and the husband initiated the sexual relationship after the therapy was over. So I think that the two-person team is important for efficacy and also for safety. The challenge will be to keep it as pressures from the insurance industry may be to minimize the cost of the therapy. So we just initiated and won a formal dispute resolution with FDA about credentials of the therapist. They wanted the lead therapist to be MD, PhD, and the second person doesn't have to have a license, but then the FDA wanted a doctor on site. And we don't have to do that in phase 3, and we have this legally agreement letter that FDA can't change it without data, but they started trying to change that for all of our future studies and for psilocybin projects. And so we spent over $250,000 on lawyers who specialized in disputes with FDA, and we won that. And we knocked out the MD, PhD, knocked out the doctor on site. It's had implications also for the psilocybin research. So I do think a two-person team is good to try to reduce sexual abuse. I think we also are going to have patient bill of rights, places where people can complain. If something like that happens, we've sort of changed a little bit of our informed consent form to indicate that you might have feelings for the therapist and you shouldn't act on them. So I don't know that we can ever have, as it rolls out, perfect record with that never happening, because it does happen a lot in psychiatry and psychotherapy already. But we will do whatever we can, and I think the situation was before that the patient didn't complain until years afterwards. So you can't rely on patients to complain. So some of this is, or at least not to patients to complain initially. So I think it's just going to have to be through the training of the therapists and through just emphasizing that this is an ethical boundary that should not be crossed.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining all of that. And just kind of harking back to the title of this talk, which is Mapping Out a Path for Psychedelic Medicine, what do you kind of see that means? Like, what is psychedelic medicine, and can you paint a picture of what the future might hold?
Yeah, well, I think that for everything except, so ketamine, you know that S-ketamine was approved without associated psychotherapy, that it was just a pharmacological treatment. You didn't need to have any support to talk about the content. But more and more what we're seeing is that the ketamine clinics that are trying to maximize patient outcomes are combining the ketamine, the S-ketamine or the generic ketamine that they're using, which is way less expensive, with therapy. So when I talk about psychedelic medicine, I'm talking about the combination of psychedelics and psychotherapy. Now, I do know that DARPA, the defense part of the ministry, the Department of Defense, has given Brian Roth, another $29 million to develop non-psychedelic psychedelics that will have neuroplasticity potentials, but without the psychedelic content, which in that context may be seen as an undesirable side effect. So I think that that's a valid approach, and we need to see, what can be done in terms of this neuroplasticity. Amanda was talking about LSD and Alzheimer's and dementia. So it may be possible to have non-psychedelic psychedelics that are, or whether we'd still call them psychedelics, but analogs of psychedelics that are non-psychedelic, that could have very significant medical possibilities. So I think that's important. But for us, it's really going to be about the training of the therapists. I do wish that our federal government would fund research with psychedelics, not just non-psychedelic analogs. But I think mapping out the future is really going to be about what kind of support is necessary for people during this kind of experience that they're having. And then how do we roll out the clinics in the setting? How do we get insurance coverage? And then this big exploration of group therapy to see if that maximizes outcomes. I personally don't think that it will, but I think it will reduce costs. But maybe we can even get certain kind of people could do better in group therapy.
Thank you. Have we got 10 minutes left, or are we finishing there? We can go to questions. Perfect.
Okay, good.
Anyone in the audience have any questions? How do I get a mic? Perfect.
Hi. Does it work?
Can you hear him?
So far.
Okay. I have a question. I heard you in the past talking about adolescence and trauma, and it was something that MAPS was exploring, and I'm just curious of any developments in that direction. Like, is something happening with like minors for like kind of preventing, I don't know, developing of something that is more like long-term and important, like for example, PTSD?
Yes, so the FDA is currently forbidding us to work with anybody younger than 18 until we've succeeded in demonstrating safety and efficacy for adults. But if we do demonstrate safety and efficacy for adults, we are required to do the work with adolescents. So that's going to be several years away before we start that. I'm very interested in doing that work because the sooner you treat people to the trauma, the more benefits when you come to talk about insurance coverage and all. The more lifetime benefits there are, the more suffering you avoid. And also the drug war is driven a lot these days on, we have to protect our kids from using drugs. And there's a lot of fear around that. And there's all these stories about the developing brains that need to be protected from smoking marijuana or using drugs. And our brains aren't fully developed till 25, stuff like that. So I think that it's going to be compassionately very powerful to do the adolescent studies. And we have to do 12 to 17-year-olds. If that works, after that, we have to work with 7 to 11-year-olds. So who are traumatized as well. So I'm very excited about it. I was actually meeting yesterday in San Francisco and had a Zoom call with some people that have a network where they have over 1,000 troubled adolescents in multiple different states and clinics, and they're very interested in helping us implement the studies with adolescents. So I think we are not permitted to do that quite yet, but in a couple of years it should be one of the first other things that we do, other indications, but also adolescents. And I'll just say another important thing that we want to do is a safety study with people on SSRIs. So this applies both to adolescents and adults, but we currently require everybody to taper off of their psychiatric medicines to be in our studies. Particularly SSRIs block the effects of MDMA. But there are anecdotal reports that you can double the dose of MDMA in people on SSRIs and get what looks like a fairly full MDMA experience. But the concern is serotonin syndrome, which has not been reported in these cases. So in addition to trying to broaden the access to PTSD from adults to adolescents, we also want to do a safety study with people with PTSD on SSRIs with increasing amounts of MDMA to see if we can help them have a full MDMA experience and not cause serotonin syndrome. And then when their trauma is reduced, if the therapy is somewhat successful, then it would be easier for them to taper off of the SSRIs. So, but I'd say the adolescent study is a top priority of ours, and we look forward to doing that.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question? Do we have any other questions at the front, please?
Yeah. Hi there. So my name's Andrea. I'm based in London, and I have tried to represent the needs and rights of drug-dependent people for 36 years. And I'm interested in whether psychedelic therapy can help so-called repeat offenders. I don't think that a lot of these people are offensive, but they have ended up behind bars because of you know what. And I'm wondering whether, you know, without making it a big political messaging, we could actually help that group of people. Thank you.
That is a terrific question, and I'm really glad you asked that, because one of the things that we're most interested in doing is working with people shortly after they're released from prison, when they're on probation, to try to help them deal with the traumas that they have experienced, in part probably prior to being in prison, but also while in prison, and then to see if that can reduce recidivism. And we know that that's something that has been studied earlier before with Timothy Leary and others, the Concord Prison Experiment with psilocybin. And it's not going to be enough to give them the MDMA experience to reduce their trauma. It's really going to be supportive services, social services afterwards as well, support groups and things like that. But I think it could be very effective. And then we also want to work inside prison, both with prison guards and with prisoners, and also police officers. And we actually have a police officer who is also a psychotherapist, who is going through our therapy training program in order to give MDMA-assisted therapy to police officers with PTSD. And there's a terrible, surprising amount of alcoholism and other substance abuse and suicide among police officers as well. So I think the whole criminal justice system is a trauma-producing system that doesn't really foster a reduction of recidivism. So we'd like to bring psychedelic psychotherapy into that system, as well as legalizing a lot of these substances so that they're not producing a lot of people going into prison. But we're very interested in doing that. One of the MAP staff is now working on a master's degree in order to prepare herself to design therapeutic interventions with MDMA with recently released prisoners to reduce recidivism. So it's a top priority of ours. It's also something that, when we think about the mainstreaming of psychedelics, when we talk about bringing it to the police, to the first responders, to the firefighters, to the emergency medical service, to the prison guards, it kind of breaks down the us and them that has been created by the drug war. So I think that work is very important.
Thank you. I think that we've got to wrap it up there. So thank you very much for joining us, and thanks for your questions.